now we're on the second part of the master philosophy. We have done 1A and 1B, and as per usual, I do really like to start with a review. So today we're bridging 1B to 2, which is dysbiosis to all of its downstream consequences, which are the topic highlights for today. So for everyone who has heard this before, please humor me while we just review this, because it's really important to nail this to understand how we're presenting the master philosophy as a framework. We've established that, with 1A, we have poor digestive dysfunction or poor digestive function, digestive dysfunction can be a root causative factor to downstream issues. So when you have things like the inadequate breakdown of nutrition, not only do you run the risk of nutritional deficiencies, you have particles of food entering parts of the digestive system that they were never meant to, i.e. proteins entering the colon, for example, and what happens there. The downregulation of digestive secretions, well, we know that when we're not making things like enzymes and bile and hydrochloric acid, the chemical process of digestion doesn't facilitate itself completely. So again, that builds on the back of the inadequate breakdown and the consequences of what's going to happen. Absorptive downregulations and microbiome consequences are all aspects that connect to this. So this is why we start with 1A, because if you don't solidify digestion, everything downstream is going to be compromised from the first bite of food. 1B is a little bit different. This is after we have established that there is an issue within digestion, and we have built the concept of dysbiosis. And I mentioned dysbiosis is a thing, but it isn't one thing, meaning it can be a multifactorial thing comprising bacteria, but also potentially parasites, fungal overgrowths. So we have to understand that the terrain is really what's being affected. So the induction and changes to the structure, the profile of the microbes that live in the microbiome alter the function of the terrain that is the microbiome and all the different inputs that the microbiome connect to. Things like the immune system, the epithelial lining will be the collateral damage where we're going to start to see symptoms manifest within our clients. And long-standing dysbiosis kind of dovetails into today, which leads to local and systemic immune activation and a lot of the associated health conditions that people get diagnosed, knowing that their digestive dysfunction may have started 20 years prior to the diagnosis of their disease. So it brings us to today. So we're in the third arm of the 4 parts here, where we're looking at broad scope immune activation, the reduction, hopefully, of oxidative stress, and bringing in a little bit of a contextual understanding of detoxification, because all these things really do come together. And at the end of today's talk, we're going to be highlighting the key products and where they fit in terms of the puzzle pieces as to how you can use them in the clinical context, and specifically what aspects of influence they may have within the whole thing. So in functional medicine, alternative medicine, natural medicine, and allopathic medicine, we use a lot of terms. We use things like immune activation, oxidative stress, inflammation, detoxification, and a lot of people use these and they don't really have a good grasp of understanding in themselves. Or what I think is even worse, when 2 people are having a conversation, there's a term called mutual mystification, where 2 people are speaking about a topic and they have 2 different viewpoints or philosophies surrounding those topics, but they don't know each other's perspective. So there might be a huge opportunity for a miscommunication, especially in a health context. Maybe when you're a practitioner working with another practitioner on the same client. So I think it's a really important thing that we establish first principles of understanding when it comes to these terms, so we can understand how, at least today, I'm going to be using them within common language as descriptive. So immune activation is pretty straightforward. And yes, it's the activation of your immune system, but the concept is something has to stimulate that activation. And usually it leads to some kind of pathological response. Typically, the common concept is something viral. So if you catch a virus, your body's going to feel absolutely terrible for a couple of days as it changes the internal state of, expressing health and energy to manning all resources to try to fight off that viral infection. And once the process has been completed and the infection has been cleared, you can return back to baseline, and then you have some sort of memory so that if the immune system encounters something like that again, the dance is already pre-choreographed. The body knows what to do. But in the context of the term immune activation, it can connect to inflammation, it can connect to oxidative stress. The important thing is something is driving a response that is activating the immune system's need to try to initiate the healing process of the insult and the clearing process so an acute thing does not become a chronic thing. And then we have to talk about the term oxidative stress. And when I explain the concept of oxidative stress to clients, I actually use the term rusting because it's so easy to visualize. You know, if they've ever left their car outside and it's rain, they walked out to the car in the morning, the brakes are orange. And what that is an example of is oxidative stress to the metal. And you see the evidence of that with the water, the iron, and the oxygen in the air interacting and creating rust. This kind of happens within the body. So the complex side of it is we're playing with this idea of redox balance, reduction and oxidization that I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. And when we experience oxidative stress, we have too much unregulated oxygen in an environment. So we oxidize the system because the body, when it has an overburden of oxygen that it can't utilize to make energy, it creates what are called free radicals. And naturally, when there is a formation of a free radical, the body has a defense that's called an antioxidant. And this natural process should be fairly balanced, where free radicals are formed under a variety of conditions. Simply eating food and making energy will yield a free radical response within a cell based upon your mitochondria breaking that food down. But providing the food we're eating is nutritious enough, we have an adequate supply of antioxidants, we have the amino acids to create antioxidant enzymes. It's a normal biological process. And in many ways, it's required for the body to signal changes within the cell. The problem becomes when it's excessive or uncontrolled. So if you've ever left an apple core on your countertop and you've come out the next morning to see that it's entirely brown, and if you really want to do a fun science experiment, just leave it there until it becomes something that resembles leather. Those are the enzymes interacting with the oxygen in the environment around that are rapidly oxidizing that piece of fruit. And you can imagine that apple, when it's a black pit of nothingness, has no nutritional value anymore. It's actually very poor choice for us to eat that. So if you take that model and apply it to a cell that has excessive oxidative stress is a cell that's not healthy anymore. And if you remember the model that we've established, the organism, the body, is composed of a series of interconnected organ systems, which are connected to individual organs, which connect to specialized tissues that create that organ, which all go back to individual cells. So the reason oxidative stress plays such a massive role in the context of aging, the development of disease, the development of conditions and diagnoses, is that a cell in a context of oxidative stress will perform very poorly in the inclusion of itself in that organ, but it will also give birth to very sick daughter cells. And this is what we're trying to do with our clients who are stuck in these healing crises where they can't get better. They're stuck in a chronic oxidative response or oxidative stress response. And it's up to us as clinicians to figure out where do we input our action to try to break the pattern or break the cycle. Because with oxidative stress comes inflammation. And we all know that, you know, inflammation can be acute and can be chronic. Acute inflammation, we're not necessarily worried about unless it becomes a chronic thing. And the way I explain inflammation is acute inflammation is the body trying to heal. Chronic inflammation is the body unable to heal. And this graphic is so wonderful because it shows you small little acute scenarios that will trigger a healing response of the body. And that's good. Like if we get sick, if we get an infection, if we, you know, cut ourselves open, we step on a nail, get food poisoning, we want an inflammatory response. The issue becomes if that insult never allows itself to be regulated and resolved, that acute scenario becomes a chronic issue. And my belief system is where that issue ends up becoming a problem is in the area of greatest susceptibility in that person's body. And I think we lose that perspective because when we have a disease diagnosis, something like an autoimmune condition, rheumatoid arthritis, we're so focused on the concept of a joint and the inflammation that's within the synovial lining of the joint. We forget that the process of that started with something that wasn't connected to the joint at all. It's where it manifested. And I think as a clinical pearl, that's such an important thing because it gives you so much more power when you're out of options of, well, what do I do for this person who's complaining about their knee pain? We don't want to put a Band-Aid over a wound. We want to teach the person how not to cut themselves moving forwards. And detoxification comes into this for a variety of reasons. But the most important one clinically is we have to understand when the body's overburdened from a perspective of an oxidative stress scenario, a state of chronic inflammation. There are intracellular metabolites and various compounds that are going to be created by the body that need to be secreted by the body at the same time. And anytime there's inflammation in the system, this is one of the most important things that's guided me clinically. Anytime there's inflammation in the system, there is a downregulation of energy production systemically. That means every organ, every tissue, every cell, regardless of if the problem originated in that organ, cell, or tissue, is going to have some sort of negative input as a result of chronic inflammation. And how this connects to detoxification is all of these compounds that are being created in addition to this normal living with our lifestyle, which is not necessarily the most health promoting thing, depending on how we're living, is going to burden the liver. And the liver is one of the, if not the most mitochondrial dense organ in the body, having up to 2,000 mitochondria per cell. If all of these decide to downregulate their energy production by 25% on account of systemic inflammation, our phases of detoxification aren't going to work properly. Our gallbladder is not going to be able to secrete enough bile because our digestive system is going to be compromised and backlogged, which means we're not going to be able to bind these toxins. If our bowel's not functioning properly, if our kidneys are overburdened, we're not going to be removing things from the system. So the inhibition of all aspects of detoxification due to inflammation, dysbiosis, nutrient deficiencies, and mitochondrial dysfunction is going to further compound the state that our clients are in. And I do believe this is one reason why we have scenarios where when we try to stimulate someone's detox pathways when they're ill, they actually feel worse because they're not ready for it. Or when someone who's ill tries to do something active because they heard exercise was a good idea, they're floored for 3 or 4 days after going to the gym once because their body doesn't have the bandwidth because it's essentially too weak and too toxic. So the clinical insights here, we have to understand what the orders of operation are when we're trying to go in and help a client in the context of oxidative stress and the resulting downstream consequences, which come back to phase 1A and 1B. We have to start addressing that digestion. We have to start addressing that dysbiosis, because these are probably a majority of the things that are the inputs that are driving the dysfunction in the first place. So this is my big picture, putting the pieces together. We know that dysbiosis-induced immune activation is a thing. And a quick recap is if your microbiome has an imbalance of microbes living within the ecosystem that are thinning your mucosal lining, and the microbes, the immune cells, and your epithelial cells are interacting too much, that's what initiates immune activation. The body is in a state of crisis. And when there's immune activation, you have the upregulation of cytokines, and it's these cytokines, which are chemical messengers, that are generating the cytokine-mediated inflammatory response because the body is trying to initiate the healing cycle. However, as I mentioned, when that acute initiation of healing doesn't take, we have the transition to chronic inflammation, which induces a state of oxidative stress within the body, within the organs, within the tissues, within the cells. So local could be in the gut, but more likely systemic, if we're talking about leaky gut, is going to cause systemic oxidative stress response, which is going to fill the gap of that little rule that I put forth, was systemic inflammation always leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. So they're going to have energy issues. And what that's going to end up doing is compromising systemic organ function. And this is where things like detox come in. So as a clinician looking at an organ level, if we understand this, we at least know what areas of the body are being most impacted and how we can justify the decisions from a supplemental, a diet, and a lifestyle perspective to give our clients all they need to increase their bandwidth, the stress tolerance, to push them out of the healing crisis back into a healing cycle. But that's not everything. And I said I did want to get a little bit deeper into oxidative stress today. Now we need to go a little bit more under a microscope. That was more of a satellite perspective. Now we're going to dig a little deeper, and you all would not believe how hard it is to find a good graphic to teach oxidative stress that is not incredibly busy and complex to explain. So I'll do my best here. We need to establish the whole concept of redox. So as I mentioned before, the cell uses a yin-yang principle, and it's really the basis of what inflammation is generated by. It's an accumulation of positive charge or a reduction back to a more neutral state. A cell actually should have an internally negatively charged state and the environment just outside the cell, the extracellular matrix, should be slightly positively charged. And this is how ion pumps and various things work to get things in and out of the cell. So if we have that balance of reduction and oxidization, a cell is in a state where it can take in nutrition and it can detoxify compounds and metabolites that are a normal part of the energy production process. As I mentioned, we'll make free radicals just by making food into energy, but there are certain byproducts, things like lactic acid and various metabolic wastes that need to be able to get out of the cell. And if someone is in a state of oxidative stress, that in and out system doesn't work so well. So everything you see on the left-hand side there, efficient energy production, normal cellular functions, things like making new proteins, making new cell membranes, that stops. And the internal state of the cell becomes one of damaged and disease. So you have things like DNA damage, rapid aging of the cell, so it has a shorter life cycle. If it gets bad enough, the cell will induce its own death. And when too many cells in an organ die, that organ becomes very weak and compromised. So what we're really looking at here is the concept of redox and how a lack of the ability to balance out the oxidative stress leads to further problems. And this is a nightmare that I'm going to try to bring attention to three key areas. Oxidative stress is going to be first initialized and understood by the mitochondria. If anyone watched the last masterclass with Ari Whitten, he was talking about how most people think that mitochondria are nothing more than energy factories. They're actually the main cell sensors. So they're always sampling the internal state of what's going on inside the cell based upon the concept of safety. If there's nothing threatening the cell, they're going to make a ton of ATP, and that's going to be the thing that underpins the function of that cell. And ultimately, someone who makes a lot of ATP has a lot of energy so that they can express a lot of health and vitality. If there is something driving an oxidative stress response, an infection, a nutritional deficiency, an environmental compound, an accumulation of toxins, emotional or chemical stresses, injuries, the oxidative response is going to be first sensed by the mitochondria, which is then going to signal to the nucleus of the cell that something isn't right. And believe it or not, this alone can change the expression of the genes inside the cell, and the cell will reestablish its way of functioning in order to fight off the threat. And this is succinctly put together in what's called the cell danger response. So on the left-hand side, you can see altered redox balance and cell signaling. That's going to compromise mitochondrial dynamics, which is a fancy way of saying energy production. So you see a drop in ATP, your body makes less energy, but you see a jump in reactive oxygen species. Well, those are free radicals. So that energy deficit is going to lead to what's called mitochondrial degeneration. And ultimately, that cell is going to die off sooner because it's lacking energy. There are other scenarios as well, which will induce early cell death. Things like calcium imbalance. When you have a disruption of the mitochondrial membrane, you can find ATP that travels outside the mitochondria into the cell. And if it gets out of the cell, it starts signaling to neighboring cells that something's not right. So all of a sudden, this danger response is going to proliferate, almost like a bad rumor would go through a high school locker room. And the third aspect is looking at these two things coming together. You're going to have defective mitochondria. And if you have an accumulation of defective mitochondria, the body will get to a point where the energy threshold is so low that that cell will just decide to kill itself. And when we have rapid cell death activation, we have chronic energy dysfunction systemically, and this is going to further the oxidative stress response and the inflammatory response. And the body is always trying to do things in an efficient way, meaning it's kind of lazy. So if the message that the body is experiencing is it's not safe internally to make energy, there is a threat inside, it's going to start changing its operating system and expressing genetics to conserve the ability to raise inflammation and downregulate energy production. And this is the concept of what's called NF-kappa B. And there are very specific initial inputs that drive the activation of NF-kappa B. When we have increased metabolic disruption with things like type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, we have unregulated activation of growth factors, things like mTOR. The stress and the damage side of things can alter DNA. It's going to increase reactive oxygen species, and it's going to drive inflammation to make the body better at raising its ability to drive inflammation. And this is why I say acute inflammation is the body trying to heal. Chronic inflammation is the body unable to heal, because this is a strategic decision by the body. It's going to upregulate these pro-inflammatory factors in a way to try to heal itself, but it can't. And as a result of that, people who are stuck in these scenarios are driving these responses for years, if not decades. And the unfortunate reality is rapid aging, the degeneration of vitality, and at some point, it goes to a place where they can't get it back. And these are usually the people that have gone to see every specialist under the sun. And unfortunately, what they're hoping for is the silver bullet or the magic key. And there is no such thing. But what we have to do is we have to figure out the order of operations of unlayering this onion in a clinical practice, and providing them, a philosophy and a framework, and maybe some practices that they've never seen before. Because ultimately what we're doing here is we're trying to increase health span. Lifespan and health span in my world aren't the same things. And if you look at the study of centenarians and various other people who live to the age of 100, the major difference is their metabolic profiles are so strong that even though they may die of similar conditions that those who don't live to 100 do, they get them much later in life because their bodies have so much more energy available to them because of robust metabolic function and the ability to downregulate the excessive oxidative stress that seems to plague modern society. So in this scenario, a really easy thing to remember is anything that's going to cause inflammation leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, leads to alterations in DNA and epigenetics. And when that's bad enough, you see the manifestations of the various conditions that are plaguing the Western world. And it's up to us as health professionals to figure out what can we do and what do we do to help these people on an individual one-by-one basis, and how do we educate people to be proactive so that this doesn't become them, for example, if it's something that's happened to their parents or a loved one. So I know that was a ton of information, and I always like to round it out. So this is our cellular putting pieces together, just to understand that redox imbalance alters cell signaling. If the cell's too oxidized, cell signaling changes to go into a crisis survival threat mode. And the main sensors, the mitochondria, start to communicate that internal change to the nucleus of the cell. The nucleus then goes, well, if I'm being bombarded with inflammation, I might as well get better at raising inflammation internally, so it upregulates that NF-kappa B pro-inflammatory transcription factor. And this adds further fuel to the fire by increasing the state of oxidative stress inside the cell. So what does a cell do? Well, it starts to display behavior of being compromised. It starts to age quicker. It's not maintaining its vitality. And if that cell gets to a threshold where it's no longer able to regenerate itself, it's done. It's going to initiate the shutdown response. And long-term degeneration and the connection to all long-term conditions on a cellular level is being shown to have this pattern time after time be very replicable. But the challenging part is the initiation of all these patterns and pathways are very multifactorial. And if we remember cell to organs, organs to organism, when I understood this, it gave me so much more power as a clinician to go, I don't have to be intimidated by a concept of heart disease or cancer or whatever someone's working on. I can just help their cells function more optimally, and I can try to harmonize all the things in their lifestyle and their environment that are going to work with my intention to help their cells find health and vitality again. And, this is the art and science of clinical practice. You have to work with the person and the personality in addition to the state and the conditions that they're sharing with you. But it seems like a pretty grim thing for most people. And, you can't necessarily have just a Live 8 concert to raise money for something like this. We need to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty. And these are questions that I'm kind of posing hypothetically to all of us. As a clinician, how are we supposed to look at these things? A lot of medicine is looking at a mechanism of action and trying to block or forcibly change it. And the natural health world, with natural health supplements, herbs, vitamins, minerals, probiotics, enzymes, they may use the same perspective with different tools. And you're never going to necessarily be a master clinician, because I believe that the body makes all these decisions consciously. It is not an accidental thing when someone becomes inflamed. So in my perspective, when I'm working with someone, I'm not trying to fix or force anything. I'm trying to support the body's desires, because if we're inflamed and something's driving that inflammatory process, If I silence the inflammation without taking care of the root cause origin of that problem, it's just going to come back when I pull out all my antioxidants. So you have to remember supplements are not enough. It's in the name, they are a supplement, but they are essential when there are scenarios of chronic inflammation and oxidative stress, because we need to push the body back into the ability to heal. And then we have to remember the concept of all the inputs and the inputs to the client, because supplements are a single input, but so is diet, so is stress management, so is sleep, and so is what's going on in that person's life. So we as clinicians really do have a limited number of tools, which sometimes makes it challenging when you've gone through your entire Rolodex of supplements and nothing's working. It's not that you can find another tool, it's how strategically can you become a better technician with those tools in introducing them in a way that's going to be able to work with the body and help the client remedy their own situation through you as a clinician. So that's why we're tying this whole story together of the master philosophy, because it lays out the framework, but you have to add your own style based upon your formal training, your likes and dislikes as a clinician, your style of communication and working with a client, and also the trial and error of just seeing if things are going to work out well as a base framework, then making your own modifications and your own adjustments along the way, because that really is the art and science. So if we do a quick recap, if we've started with digestion and we have digestive dysfunction, we know that digestive dysfunction at some point is going to lead to dysbiosis. Some people get really lucky. You clear up the digestive system, and not only do they feel a ton better, the dysbiosis goes away, their bowel habits return, and that's the end of their story. That's a nice short ride on the bus, in my opinion. However, we did discuss last time that dysbiosis is not only multifactorial, there are different degrees of development of dysbiosis. So it can lead up to a whole host of changes where you might be thinking, oh, well, if someone is dysbiotic, I'm going to give them a probiotic. That should work. And if it doesn't, what do you do? Well, that means you may have a little bit more digging to do in terms of understanding, maybe I need to layer in digestive support with the probiotic, possibly do some cleansing of the microbiome or some antimicrobial activity, and remedy that so I can help the body heal its own leaky gut, because I know that's driving the immune activation. And today we understood that immune activation is the precipice to all this. You have immune activation leading to local issues within the gut, and the gut will try to put a lid on those local issues, but at some point it's going to overwhelm the very poor physical barrier that is the epithelial layer, and that's going to become a systemic problem. And that's where the concept of metabolic endotoxemia comes in, where you have compounds leaking into the bloodstream, leaking into the lymphatic system, and they get access to systemic circulation, which means these pro-inflammatory compounds that are inducing, interactions with immune cells, which generate cytokines, can find themselves all over the body, and they can cause issues in the heart, they can cause issues in the liver, in the gallbladder, in the joints, in the brain, and then the ensuing processes of oxidative stress, inflammation, and the downregulation of detoxification are part and parcel of this whole process taking place. So all of this stuff kind of combines together to create the pathway of the degenerative conditions that are all implicated with the cell danger response, which is such a beautiful way of buttoning up this whole concept to understand the cell is making decisions strategically, the body is trying to neutralize the threat, and there are processes to the healing cycle that have to be jumped through in order for the person to get back to a state of health. Because I think this perspective is absolutely essential. A supplement is not a fix in the same way that the drug doesn't resolve an illness. We know that no one developed a chronic condition from a drug deficiency. The same is said of a supplement, other than maybe vitamins and minerals, which can be, cause long latent systemic nutritional deficiencies. But a supplement induces a change within the body. And if the body is not ill, and the supplement is chosen strategically, that initial change is going to be the thing that the body needs to help break through the healing cycle and heal itself. It's very much like a lock and key mechanism. You have to pair the right lock with the right key to open the door. So an example would be knowing that sulforazyme, which is an incredible supplement and has a lot of success in scenarios of Hashimoto's, doesn't fix an autoimmune thyroid condition. What sulforazyme can do is it can upregulate a mechanism, which we'll talk about, that helps the body temper immune activation and therefore reduce inflammation, which hopefully helps the body silence where that disease is being manifested in the thyroid. However, you're going to have to pair that with a lot of other things that Dr. Eric and Dr. Kelly have been speaking about in the last couple of months, which they're actually having a seminar at the end of the month about the thyroid debacle and how the healing crisis sustains itself in Minnesota. So we have to understand that this philosophy reframes, I think, how we use supplements. They're not the fix, they're a very strategic tool. And the more intelligently you can use that tool, the more success you will get with your client. So I did create a little bit of a framework to address oxidative stress. These are in categories. It's not step 1 through 4, because in some cases, number one, you can't put them in steps per se. And I think the second thing is sometimes you have to do things concurrently if you want to be very holistic and comprehensive in your treatment path. So we'll start with category 1. And category 1 is what I call antioxidant reserve. So most antioxidants are in the body are either in the form of what I call free antioxidants that come in the form of vitamins, in the form of things like, proanthocyanidins and blueberries, colorful pigments and compounds within the body, turmeric. A good reserve of antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals are going to give the cells a reserve to buffer that free radical stress that's a normal part of just everyday life and metabolism. If we as people are living a toxic lifestyle, we're driving more pro-oxidants into the system. So as a result, we therefore need to have more antioxidants to balance out this action-reaction scenario. So if your client is eating foods that are high in polyunsaturated fats, if they're eating foods that are high in calories, but they're deficient in cofactors like vitamins and minerals, if they're breathing poor quality air, if they live in an environment or they have a workplace environment that's incredibly toxic, they're going to be bringing more pro-oxidants into their system. The strategy here is to make sure that you baseline the diet and the supplement plan to provide the necessary antioxidants so they don't run into that state where the teeter-totter tips in favor of free radical stress because they can't neutralize the free radical stress. This is category 1. Category 2 are more powerful intracellular antioxidant enzymes. They don't get a lot of publication or a lot of publicity outside of things like glutathione, but glutathione, superoxide dismutase, and catalase are our single most powerful antioxidant enzyme system that are inside of every single cell. And when we deplete these as a result of, again, the same scenario with increased pro-oxidants, but the inability to regenerate these antioxidants is actually down to digestive ability and adequate protein and amino acid intake, because all of them are amino acid dependent to be formed, and they're mineral dependent as cofactors to be able to be activated. Copper is needed for superoxide dismutase, but so is manganese in other scenarios. And the whole idea is they need to be in balance because it's like a game of hot potato. A free radical comes in, an oxidative reaction will happen as a result of superoxide dismutase interacting with a free radical. And then that leaves another compound that glutathione reductase needs to interact with, and then that needs to be recharged. So again, this piggybacks on category 1, having adequate vitamins and minerals and antioxidants from diet, but making sure that we have adequate amino acids and proteins and the ability to break our proteins down is absolutely essential. And this is why in some cases, when clients have very compromised digestive systems, supplementing with these things is a really good strategy in an acute stage of inflammation to help the body replace what's not there in adequate status. Category 3, I call epigenetic activation. And the most powerful epigenetic activator of NRF2 that we know of is sulforazyme. So sulforaphane, specifically from broccoli sprout extract. There are others that have very powerful benefits like boswellia, turmeric, various other herbal compounds. But what broccoli sprout extract or sulforaphane does is more of a long-standing anti-inflammatory response. So if I can create a little bit of an understanding, giving someone a supplemental antioxidant like superoxide dismutase and catalase will help them in a very acute stage scenario. But we want the body to be able to generate its own antioxidant reserve. So if it's been inflamed for a while and the NF-kappa B is pushed up, the NRF2 is the other side of the teeter-totter that we want to push up as we simultaneously push down the NF-kappa B. If we remedy what's driving the inflammatory response in the form of an infection, a viral thing, a bacterial thing, a fungal thing, that's going to naturally make the body able to tip that teeter-totter back into the other side, which is going to upregulate genetic expression of increased mitochondrial activity, increased energy production, increased antioxidant synthesis, and increased phase 2 detoxification. So not only do we protect the cell from dying, but we can flip that cell out of a crisis state back into a healing state, so it can actually express vitality and then give birth to healthier cells. This is the bigger picture on a cellular level of what we're trying to do for people who are stuck in these healing crises. This is category 3. And category 4 is what I call immune support resolution, where we know that the immune system is going to be triggered and stimulated until we've removed the root causative factor. Here's where things like systemic enzymes and proteolytic enzymes come in, because again, they don't go and heal the problem. But what proteolytic enzymes do is they work in conjunction or in tandem with the immune system to be able to go to the specific site of inflammation based upon where that site may be. And we have different enzymes for different body systems, which we really dive into next month. Excuse me. But what we're doing here is when we've dealt with the source of inflammation, we want to push successful resolution. So using things like protease enzymes, serrapeptidase, lumbrokinase, various things that work in tandem with the immune cells to resolve the inflammation is going to be what gets that client out of a crisis state. And all of these things have to be thought of in conjunction with the right lifestyle, dietary, and supplemental protocols to be a holistic intervention. Obviously, the client is going to be coming to you with a lot of things. So it's our job to think through these things and craft a really strong protocol in conjunction with the proper supporting aspects. So how do you choose your products? What is your antioxidant cocktail? This is really cool because what these products do is they have a unique perspective in terms of how they influence not only the body, but the specific branches of the immune system. So something like chlorozyme with chlorella and spirulina, we know that there's an incredible benefit to DNA protection, healing DNA damage and broken strands of DNA that may come as a result of an inflammatory response, but they can also be binders of things and help escort various compounds and toxins out of the system rather than letting them be reuptaken and circulated again back into the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. Vitamin D is so well known for its immune suppressing effects. Most people who can't resolve chronic inflammation likely, not always, but likely have severe vitamin D deficiency, because vitamin D is more like a hormone than that of a vitamin. And what it does is it acts as somewhat of an off switch to making the immune cells, which have been stimulated and agitated, able to resolve and downregulate their cytokine production. So once the threat has been neutralized, the body can basically turn off the aggression. Immunozyme piggies back really nicely with D3zyme, because immunozyme is kind of like a multivitamin for your immune system, specifically working on what's called T regulatory cell function. So T cells are part of our adaptive immune system, our innate immune system, and we have different branches of T cells that know how to increase the inflammatory response when triggered. But once it's gone away, we want the T regulatory cells to bring things back into balance. Many people who suffer with chronic inflammation, autoimmunity, cancers, metabolic disorders have a deficiency of T regulatory cells, and they have a heightened response of Th1, Th2, Th17 cells, which keep them stuck in that healing cycle. So immunozyme in conjunction with vitamin D3zyme can be incredibly beneficial for a whole host of non-specific inflammatory scenarios. And then using things like Tavigo, which is a green tea extract, it's a very powerful antioxidant that really does have a strong affinity for metabolic support. So in scenarios of mitochondrial dysfunction connecting to increased free radical stress, green tea extract really does have a strong benefit, not only to help act as a direct antioxidant, but it seems to stimulate mitochondrial function and fat metabolism to restore the energy deficit. And then using something like Sun Spectrum, which is a fiber that is paired with turmeric and alpha lipoic acid, fiber specifically that feeds bifidogenic bacteria, can increase the production of butyrate. And we know that butyrate, while being a fuel for the colon cells, the lining of the colon, also acts as an inflammatory molecule on a multitude of different fronts. Number one, it increases the ability to generate energy in the form of butyrate being used by the mitochondria of the colon cells. And it also has a direct anti-inflammatory effect at the genetic level. So we can suppress inflammation locally, and that should therefore have a systemic effect. Now, a lot of these products are general products. They're not necessarily targeted for any specific condition, but how you combine them together and strategically implement them within a specific protocol can be very powerful. And now we're going into the next phase. So category 2, we talked about intracellular antioxidants. I personally think this is the most underutilized product in our entire product line, because nowhere do I see a higher and more potent dose of a combination of superoxide dismutase and catalase in the marketplace. Everyone knows using liposomal glutathione or N-acetylcysteine will boost your glutathione production, but glutathione is just one of the three amigos. It's the end chain in the three-chain link, and if they're not in balance, if you're upregulating glutathione production, we need catalase and superoxide dismutase to be functionally active before glutathione peroxidase can have its time in the sun. So I really use this one quite successfully with people who are in a chronic state. And it's very interesting because not a lot of people think about the effects of these things within the cells of the colon or the cells of the small intestine. And I think that's likely where we're seeing the most benefit, because downregulating that is going to attenuate the local inflammatory response, theoretically, that will then help offset what would be a chronic inflammatory response if we have a breach of that epithelial barrier. And then we have our NRF2 stimulator, which I spoke about. And the difference between this specific product in comparison to some others in the marketplace is it is stabilized sulforaphane. So you don't need the glucoraphanin and the myrosinase as essentially precursor molecules in hopes that they come together. They're here, but we have incredibly stable direct sulforaphane that's ready for absorption. So it's got a greater degree of potency. So the effect is probably going to be felt a lot faster. Now, when it comes to using this in conjunction with the others, I have a philosophy that I do believe is correct. If someone's in an acute phase, and we talked about someone who's been dealing with inflammation for quite some time, and they may not have the bandwidth to raise their own internal antioxidant state, I would not give this to someone until you're comfortable that their detoxification pathways are open and strong and their mitochondrial function is ready for this kind of stimulus. I like to do a Youthzyme first to get them out of an acute state if they've been dealing with something for quite some time. It's an acute phase reactant. And then I transition to sulfurazyme when I feel that client is ready for it. If you have someone who's healthy and they're just dealing with something and you know that you've tried things in the past and they can tolerate something like this, you could go right to this product. But again, it's situation by situation or situationally dependent. And that's, of course, as the clinician, it's your decisions as to when to use those things specifically. And my other favorite product in the product line, not that that really matters, it's just a little piece of information. I think Therazyme is one of the most beneficial, safe, everyday supplements that people can take, whether they are trying to be proactive in preventing the accumulation of inflammation. Because I had this thought today. At any moment in the day, every human is experiencing some degree of inflammation. There's very few people who are chronically free of any kind of inflammatory insult. So thinking that way, having some degree of proactive anti-inflammatory support that you use on a regular basis to take the burden off of your immune system, I think is just a good strategy to age well. That being said, this product for someone who is in the process of dealing with something a lot more aggressive and a lot more chronic is incredibly beneficial because it works in areas that the other products don't. It's a combination of all the different proteolytic enzymes that are going to migrate to the areas of effect, excuse me, to work with the immune system in trying to resolve that inflammation. And if we take the whole perspective of the master philosophy, if we've dealt with digestion, if we've dealt with the dysbiosis and the infection, and we're in the dealing with the oxidative stress stage, this is going to complement and piggyback things like direct antioxidants or NRF2 stimulators, because you're taking a more holistic approach when it comes to dealing with the concept of inflammation and how you can address it. And again, we aren't diving into it because we don't have time, but we're assuming that diet, lifestyle, stress management, emotional regulation, exercise, all of these things have been personalized for the client. And I wanted to include a couple great articles that I came across in putting this presentation together that I think will be really good reading for people who want to dive a little bit deeper, because we do have a limited amount of time to do this. So with that being said, everyone, I really hope that was helpful today. My goal was to take oxidative stress, immune activation, and inflammation and make it something that was conceptually digestible on a big picture level, um, mechanistically digestible on an intracellular microscopic level. And hopefully that gives you a greater degree of understanding and insight as to how the master philosophy is coming together.